She hadn't expected to see him again. Not like this. Not in the soft orange light of a California morning, standing beside the faded rosebushes she'd planted back in '92, with his hands deep in the pockets of a leather jacket that had probably seen more red carpets than her entire wardrobe. Clara Rose Bennett was 62 years old and owned a small bookstore cafe just off the Pacific Coast Highway. Her days were filled with dog-eared novels, cinnamon scones, and the quiet rustle of pages turning in the hands of customers old enough to remember when real stars walked the silver screen. She was content. Or, at least, she told herself so. And then Sylvester Stallone walked into her life again after 43 years. The last time she saw him, he was just Sly. Not Rocky, not Rambo, not the face that had once adorned every poster in her teenage niece's bedroom. Just the lanky, awkward boy she met one summer when she worked as a production assistant on a low-budget film in New York. He'd been an extra with no lines and an uneven jaw, always scribbling in a notebook, talking about some script he was working on. Back then, they were both nobodies. He had dreams so big they didn't fit in his thrift store boots, and she had a way of listening that made a man feel like he could rewrite the stars. And they had 1 week. 7 days. A blur of cheap coffee, rainy fire escapes, and one night that still clung to her skin like the last whisper of perfume on a favorite sweater. But Hollywood swallowed him whole. She watched from afar, first in newspapers, then in theaters, later on TV interviews where he grinned that half-smile like he knew something the world didn't. He never mentioned her. Not once. And she never tried to reach him. She told herself it had just been a fling. A beautiful, forgotten moment in a life that moved on. Until now. Clara, he said, voice gravel-deep, cracked with time, but unmistakable. He looked older, of course. They both did. His hair had silver in it, and his eyes had the kind of quiet only earned by men who'd seen the inside of too many. Had that same tilt of the head when he smiled, like he was asking permission to be there. I didn't know where else to go, he added, and for the first time in decades, her knees almost gave out beneath her. She didn't speak. Not at first. Just let the moment stretch between them like an old song playing from a record they both forgot they loved. You're supposed to be in Malibu, she finally said, the words coming slower than she wanted. Or can. Or wherever retired icons go to stay beautiful and relevant. He chuckled softly, and it hurt her more than she expected. I was. For a while. But things change. He didn't have to say more. The tabloids had been relentless. His third wife had left him. Again. His daughters had grown and gone, carving their own space in the shadow of his fame. He'd been seen alone more often than not, and his last film, the one he swore would be his legacy, had flopped. Badly. She knew all of this, of course. It was hard not to when the internet wrapped around you like static cling. But none of it explained why he was standing in her garden, where the wind carried the smell of old lavender and forgotten promises. He glanced toward the cafe, where the morning rush had just begun. The windows glowed with the laughter of 2 elderly regulars and the faint sound of Sinatra playing from a dusty Bluetooth speaker. It was a modest place. Honest. And it made her chest ache with a kind of pride she hadn't felt in years. You did good, Clara, he said, looking around. Really good. And then he looked at her, really looked, like he was trying to measure time by the lines near her eyes and the way her hands folded over one another. Why are you here, Sly? She asked. He hesitated. Just enough to make her heart stutter. I'm dying, he said quietly. The world didn't fall apart. The birds still chirped, the breeze still fluttered through the ivy. But Clara felt something inside her shatter, not from the news, not exactly, but from the way he said it. Soft. Like an apology. Doctors say 6 months, maybe a year. Some rare neurological thing. Slow. Quiet. Not painful. He smiled, bitterly. Not cinematic enough, I guess. Her breath caught. I didn't come to make a scene. Or stir up old feelings, he said. I just wanted to see someone who knew me before I became this. And there it was. The truth of it. The weight of fame stripped bare in a single sentence. She didn't cry. Clara wasn't the crying type. But her fingers trembled just enough that she had to press them into her palms. What do you want from me, Sylvester? She asked, and this time she made sure to use the full name. It felt more real. More distant. Safer. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, slow, careful, and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out an envelope. Plain. Worn. Her name written on it in that same scrawled, uneven handwriting she hadn't seen since 1982. I wrote this to you the day after I left New York, he said. I never mailed it. She took it, fingers brushing his. The paper felt like it was holding its breath. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he added. Or for anything, really. I just needed to remember who I was before I became someone I don't recognize anymore. And then he turned, just like that, walked back toward the road, leaving her with the wind and the envelope and 1,000 unsaid words that began to burn through 40 years of silence. Clara didn't open the letter right away. She sat on the bench behind the cafe after closing, the twilight casting long shadows across the gravel, the warm scent of baked scones still lingering in the air. Her hands cradled the envelope like it was alive, like opening it might split something open inside her that had long ago been stitched shut. The paper was soft at the edges, the ink slightly smudged. Her name, just Clara, was written in the kind of hesitant script that made her chest ache. She remembered how he used to write everything down, dreams, lines, ideas that came to him while stirring instant coffee in their shared mug back in that terrible Queen's apartment. With a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, she unfolded the letter. Clara, I don't know how to say goodbye to someone who saw me before the world ever did. You saw me when I was broke, confused, hungry, and worse. You saw me when I believed in myself too much and not enough, all at once. If I could stay, I would. But something tells me I won't come back the same. Hollywood doesn't leave space for old souls, and mine already feels ancient. But if I ever become someone worth remembering, I hope you still think of me. Love always, Sly. She read it once, then again, and then a third time, slower. Each sentence felt like a doorway opening into a room she'd boarded up long ago. He hadn't forgotten her. Not completely. And now, with his time running short, he was back. Not to reclaim her, but to be seen one last time by the version of himself she remembered. She slept restlessly that night. Her dreams were filled with strange flashes. Him in the rain, her well of that Queen's walk-up, the smell of cheap aftershave, a red scarf she thought she'd lost. The next morning, she woke up before sunrise and did something she hadn't done in years. She walked to the ocean. It was only 3 blocks away, but she usually avoided it. Too many memories, too many lovers' benches, too many echoes. But that morning, the horizon looked like a promise, and she needed to think. She didn't expect to find him there. Sylvester was sitting on a piece of driftwood, legs stretched out, wearing the same leather jacket from yesterday. His eyes were closed, listening to the tide. He didn't look surprised when she sat beside him. Couldn't sleep either, he asked without opening his eyes. She didn't answer, just sat with him, watching the foam roll over the sand. You looked happy yesterday, he said after a while. Content. You always wanted something quiet. Peaceful. You always wanted noise, she replied. He chuckled. I thought noise meant I mattered. Clara turned toward him. And now I think silence has got its own kind of grace. There was a long pause. Not awkward, just full. He finally looked at her. I'm renting a place nearby. Little house. Nothing fancy. Would you come by sometime? She hesitated. He noticed. Just to talk, he added. Just for company. I don't expect anything. Clara wanted to say no. She should have. It was safer, cleaner. But the truth was, her heart had started doing something unfamiliar the moment he stepped back into her world. Not racing. Not aching. Something quieter. Like remembering. I'll think about it, she said, standing. He nodded like he'd already expected that. As she walked away, he called out softly, I never stopped wondering about you. She didn't turn around. 3 days passed. Then 4. He didn't come back to the cafe, and she didn't go to the address scribbled on the back of the letter. But every night she found herself rereading his words, tracing the edges of the page, whispering parts of it like prayers to herself. Then, on the 5th day, he left something at her doorstep. A book. Not a signed headshot. Not a flashy gift. A first edition copy of The Old Man and the Sea. Inside, in pencil, he'd written, You always said this was the only kind of story that mattered. Quiet struggle. Dignified loss. Maybe that's all I ever wanted to be. Still hoping you'll come by. S. That was the moment something in her gave way. She drove to the address that night. It was a modest bungalow nestled under the curve of an old sycamore tree. The porch light was on. Wind chimes hummed in the breeze. It didn't feel like the home of a movie legend. It felt like a place where someone had gone to disappear gently. He opened the door like he'd been standing just behind it, waiting. There were no candles, no wine, no grand gestures. Just 2 mugs of tea already steeping and music playing low from an old record player. Ella Fitzgerald, maybe, or Nina Simone. He didn't try to touch her, didn't try to reach for anything. He just smiled and said, "I kept the tea warm." And so she stepped inside, not back in time, just forward, into something new that still remembered something old. The first hour passed with nothing but tea and old records. They sat on opposite ends of the small living room, surrounded by walls lined with books, vinyl sleeves, and faded photographs that looked like they'd been collected rather than displayed. There were no awards, no posters, no trace of Rocky, Rambo, or red carpets. It was the room of a man who had once been someone loud and had chosen, deliberately, to become someone quiet. Clara studied him as he leaned back in the worn armchair. His shoulders weren't what they once were. His hands, once fists of granite and a dozen action shots, trembled slightly when he lifted the teacup. But his eyes, those eyes that had once looked at her in the middle of a New York downpour like she was a secret only he knew, still carried that same quiet fire. "How long have you been here?" she finally asked. "Couple months," he said. "Since the diagnosis." "And before that?" He smiled a little. "Doing the things everyone expects a fading actor to do. Voiceovers. Guest appearances. One too many memoir attempts. All hollow. Even the memoir?" He looked at her. "It didn't have you in it." She didn't know what to say to that. "I kept trying to write about the rise," he continued. "The struggle. The studio fights. The set stories. But it all felt performative. Like I was selling nostalgia." Clara sipped her tea, watching him. "Isn't that what people want?" He nodded. "Yeah, but I think I wanted to write something real. Something unfinished." She shifted slightly. "Why me, Sly? Why now?" He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Because you're the only one who knew me when none of it mattered. When I was just a guy who made bad coffee and worse jokes. Before the sculpted body. Before the scripts. Before I became a brand." "And what do you want now?" she asked. He thought for a long moment. "Just to be a man again." Friend. In the weeks that followed, Clara began visiting every few days. Sometimes she brought soup or pie from the cafe. Sometimes she just brought silence. They talked about everything but the obvious, the ticking clock. She told him about her divorce, the one that left more confusion than heartbreak. About her daughter in Portland, too busy and too far away. About the ache in her knees and the way she still sometimes reached for the phone to call her mother, even though she'd been gone 7 years. He listened like a man making room in his soul for someone else's life. And when he spoke, it wasn't in monologues or rehearsed lines. He talked about regret. About missing his daughter's recitals because of press tours. About waking up in hotel rooms not knowing which country he was in. About winning awards that didn't fill the space inside him. "You were right, you know," he said one night, as they watched the ocean from his porch. "That summer in New York. You said I was chasing the wrong kind of love." Clara smiled faintly. "You thought love was applause. And you thought love was quiet loyalty. Still do." He reached for her hand then, just briefly, just enough. They didn't speak of the illness, but it made itself known. A forgotten word here. A stiffness in his movements. The occasional wince when he reached too far. She noticed. He knew she noticed. But neither of them said anything. And one night, he asked her a question that changed everything. "If I wrote it now, a real memoir, one I never published, just for me, would you help me remember it right?" Clara blinked. "You want me to help you write your life?" He shook his head. "No. I want you to help me find it." They started small. Old tapes. Photos. Newspaper clippings. She brought her laptop, and he brought the stories. Not the polished ones, not the studio-approved tales, just memories, raw and half-formed. The script he wrote in a spiral notebook before Rocky ever existed. The time he lived in a bus station for 3 nights. The dog he sold for $30 and bought back for $100 after the film hit. And somewhere along the way, she started remembering her own life. In between transcribing his stories, she started writing fragments of her own, the moment she knew her marriage was over. The poem her daughter wrote at age 7. The way her father danced with her mother in the kitchen on Sundays. It wasn't just a memoir anymore. It was 2 people gathering the broken pieces of who they used to be and seeing what kind of mosaic they could make out of the edges. And then, one evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the porch in golden light, he asked her, "Do you ever think we got it wrong?" Clara turned to him. "What do you mean?" "Back then. Walking away. Letting it all be a memory." She didn't answer right away. "I think," she said softly, "that we were the right people. But the wrong time." He nodded slowly. "And now?" he asked. "Now." The word hung between them like a dare. She reached for his hand. Not as a symbol. Not as a promise. Just as a moment. And for the first time in 4 decades, They didn't feel like echoes. They felt like a beginning. He started forgetting names. Not hers, not yet, but little ones. A barista's name at the cafe. The model of his first car. The exact year Rocky II premiered. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing cinematic. Just the quiet kind of forgetting that slips in like water under a closed door. Clara noticed. Of course she did. She kept a small notebook now, one she didn't show him. Just dates, details, things he might forget but wouldn't want to lose. The name of his childhood dog. His favorite Sinatra album. The night she found him asleep on the porch, breathing slow, with a book open on his chest and his lips just slightly moving, as if reciting something only he could hear. They were still writing. Most days, the memoir sat in a shared Google Doc neither of them fully knew how to use. She typed, he talked. Sometimes he rambled, sometimes he whispered, and sometimes he stared off into the distance like the memories were fading even as he tried to pull them back. One afternoon, as she read back a passage about his first time on a real film set, he interrupted her. I don't remember that. Clara paused. You told it to me last week. He looked down at his hands. I don't remember telling it. Or being there. She set the laptop aside. It's okay. No, it's not. The quiet in the room grew heavy, like gravity pressing down on both of them. Outside, wind stirred the branches of the sycamore. A record clicked to its final groove. I'm scared, Clara. It was the first time he'd said it. She moved to the armrest of his chair, leaned in close, and placed her hand on his shoulder. I am too. He looked up at her, and there was no pretense left. No actor. No legend. Just a man who had been worshipped by millions and was now hoping to be remembered by one. What happens when I don't recognize myself anymore? He asked. Clara swallowed hard. Then I'll remind you. He let out a long breath, then nodded. Just once. And something about the way he did it made her realize that he believed her. They began recording his stories instead. He hated the sound of his voice, said it sounded like gravel and regret, but she told him it was strong. It's the voice people grew up with, she said. Let it tell the truth now. So he did. Late at night, in a warm room with the smell of black tea and wood polish, he spoke into a microphone about his mother's rings, about the letter his father never sent, about the day he first held his daughter and felt more terrified than any fight scene had ever made him. Clara would sit beside him, watching the levels flicker on the screen, watching his words become something permanent, something they could hold on to. One night, after a particularly long recording, he leaned back and said, I should have married you. She laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it hurt. You would have driven me crazy, she said. You would have saved me, he replied. They didn't speak for a while after that. Just sat there in the hush of things unsaid. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, I never stopped loving you, Clara. She closed her eyes. You were the only thing I didn't write into a script. Weeks passed. Then a month. The forgetting got worse. He missed a step one morning and fell, hard, bruising his ribs. When Clara found him, he was sitting on the floor, dazed and angry. I hate this, he muttered, voice thick with frustration. I hate being small. You're not small, she said gently, kneeling beside him. I'm not me. Yes, you are. You're the version I love. He looked at her, and for a second she saw something flicker, recognition, warmth, fear, and then it was gone, like a wave pulling back into the sea. Later that night, she found him sitting in the dark with the recorder in his hand. I don't want to disappear, he whispered. You won't. Promise me. Clara knelt in front of him, took the recorder, and pressed it to his chest. We're saving all of you. Every piece. Even the ones you forget. His eyes brimmed with tears. Not the kind that fall, but the kind that tremble, caught in the dam of a man who's fought too long to let them go. Tell me something true, he asked softly. She leaned in. You were loved. And for the first time in a long time, he closed his eyes and slept without fear. The project changed after that. It wasn't a memoir anymore. It was a lifeline. Clara spent her mornings cataloging audio, labeling files like memories in a box. Sly, age 28, losing his first audition. Sly, age 39, crying after his daughter's surgery. Sly, age 74, saying her name like it was a prayer. She made a playlist of his favorites and played it when he was restless. She labeled old photos. She hung sticky notes with names and faces, not because he asked, but because she knew he'd need them soon. And one day, in the middle of a sentence, he paused, looked at her, and asked, Are you my wife? It shattered her. She smiled gently, nodded, and said, Yes. Not because she wanted to lie, but because in that moment, for him, it was true. And maybe it was enough. Autumn came slowly to the California coast, painting the sky with the kind of soft gold Clara used to describe in poems she never showed anyone. The days grew shorter, but somehow, time seemed to stretch. Long afternoons sitting on the porch wrapped in sweaters, warm tea cooling on the table, and the faint, comforting hum of the sea whispering just out of sight. Sylvester was quieter now. Some days, he didn't speak at all. Other days, he asked the same question twice in a row and didn't realize it. And sometimes, on the rarest, most painful mornings, he looked at Clara like a stranger, with eyes searching for something familiar in a face he couldn't name. But even then, when she touched his hand or said his name with that gentle firmness only she could manage, something inside him softened. He would nod, or blink slowly, or lean just slightly toward her, like a compass being tugged back north. She started staying overnight. At first, it was just when he had bad spells, confusion, or nightmares, or long silences that broke into weeping. But eventually, it became every night. She brought her own pillow, left a sweater hanging over the back of his chair, labeled the kitchen cabinets. She didn't need to say it, and neither did he. This was home now. For both of them. One night, as rain tapped against the windows and an old Miles Davis record spun softly in the background, Clara found him sitting in the dark with the recorder in his lap. "I heard my own voice today," he said. She knelt beside him. "Which one?" "Me. Young. Angry. Wanting everything." She smiled. "You were beautiful. So full of fire. I didn't deserve you back then." She shook her head. "You didn't know how to keep me." "That's not the same." He looked at her, and this time there was no confusion. Just sadness. And something like peace. "Will you finish it?" he asked. "The memoir." He nodded. "If I don't?" "If I can't." Clara reached for his hand. "I already am." In December, he stopped recording. It wasn't a decision. There was no final line, no closing statement. He just stopped picking up the microphone. It sat on the table, always ready, but untouched. Like an open invitation he no longer knew how to RSVP to. Clara didn't push him. Instead, she started reading to him. At first, it was his own words, the ones she'd transcribed over the past few months. She read them like stories, soft and rhythmic, and when he was lucid, he would smile, or laugh, or quietly whisper, "That really happened," as if he were rediscovering his own life. Later, when even those stories became too distant, she read him books. Hemingway, Steinbeck, Baldwin, and her own. Pages she'd written in the quiet hours between his naps, poems, fragments, memories stitched with hope. Sometimes, when she read, he'd reach for her hand without looking. It was the only kind of communication he had left, warmth. By late January, he rarely left bed. The house was dim, hushed. Friends had stopped visiting. His daughters came once, briefly. They stood in the doorway awkwardly, looking at a father they remembered as marble and fire, now soft and slipping away. Clara guided them gently, gave them space, reminded them to speak softly, hold his hand, just be present. They cried in the hallway. She held them both and said nothing, because sometimes grief is too early and too loud to be answered. When they left, he asked, "Were they okay?" She nodded. "They love you." "That's good," he said, and closed his eyes again. On a warm February morning, she woke up early. The house was still, filled with that strange kind of silence that doesn't just mean quiet, but something has ended. She walked to his room. The covers were neatly tucked around him, his face turned toward the window, where sunlight was just starting to spill across the floor. He looked peaceful. She sat on the edge of the bed, touched his cheek. Still warm. "Hey," she whispered. No answer. Her breath caught in her throat. "Hey, love." Still nothing. Clara leaned down, pressed her forehead to his, and for the first time in years, let herself cry. No fear, no shame, just the deep, aching release of something wholly passing. She stayed like that for a long time. Later that day, when the necessary things had been done, the calls made, the hand shaken, the silence returned, she walked out to the porch, sat in his chair, and held the microphone. She pressed record. "My name is Clara Bennett," she said softly, voice steady despite the weight, "and this is the story of a man who the world thought it knew." She took a breath. "But I knew the parts that mattered." She kept recording until the sun dipped low behind the trees and her tea had gone cold. Her voice didn't break. She spoke of the boy from Queens, the fighter without gloves, the man who loved her in silence and remembered her when everything else had faded. And when she finished, she placed the recorder on the table. Let it rest. Then she looked at the sea and whispered, "You're not gone. Not from here." And she meant it. Spring came with wildflowers that bloomed like small rebellions across the cliffs. Clara found herself walking more, breathing in the newness of the air like it might somehow carry his voice back to her. But the house was quiet now, and the chair on the porch stayed empty, though she hadn't moved it. She wouldn't. Not yet. She didn't rush the next steps. There was no funeral in the traditional sense. That had been his wish, no spectacle, no celebrity tributes, no red carpet send-off. Just cremation. Simplicity. Ashes, scattered in the ocean. But she gave him something else. A private service in her bookstore cafe before opening hours. She invited only those who mattered. A few old friends from the industry. His daughters. 2 neighbors who used to bring lemons from their backyard tree. She baked scones herself. Brewed his favorite tea. Played Sinatra low on the speakers. At the center of the cafe, she placed his old notebook. The one he carried in New York, the pages yellowed and frayed, filled with beginnings of screenplays and quotes from boxing legends, and, scribbled on the inside cover, the name Clara written over and over again like a teenager carving it into a tree. She didn't speak much that day. But before everyone left, she opened the binder she'd spent the past few weeks compiling. Pages printed and bound, with a title that wasn't flashy or clever, just true. Still sly, a life remembered in small things. It wasn't a memoir in the traditional sense. It was part memory, part dialogue, part audio transcript. Some chapters were just photographs with captions. One was just a playlist. Another, a letter he never sent, to himself at age 25. Near the end, a chapter titled The Last Days, written entirely in Clara's voice. His daughters cried as they read it. Not the kind of tears that come from loss, but the kind that come from understanding. You gave him back to us, the oldest whispered. No, Clara said gently. He gave himself back. Weeks passed. Then months. The cafe stayed open. Clara ran it with the same quiet elegance as always. But she added something new. A shelf near the window, tucked between the poetry and biography sections. No big sign. Just a hand-painted card that read, Stories We Leave Behind. It held one book. Still sly. Clara didn't sell it. People could read it there, in the sunlight, while sipping their tea. Some came just for that. Tourists who had grown up watching his films. Old women who remembered his smile. Young girls who had never seen Rocky, but cried by page 30. One man brought his mother, who read the final chapter aloud, holding her son's hand the whole time. And slowly, Clara began receiving letters. Dozens. Then hundreds. From women in Kansas who said, This reminded me of the husband I lost. From widows in Florida who wrote, I thought I was the only one who remembered who he really was. From a former film assistant in Toronto who confessed, I met him once at a party. He told me to never write for applause. I never forgot. Some of the letters weren't even addressed to her. They were addressed to him. She kept every one. Tied them in ribbons. Placed them in a cedar box beneath the counter. You're still being loved, she'd whisper to the box when she thought no one was listening. On what would have been his 79th birthday, Clara walked to the sea. She carried the last of his ashes in a small brass urn. Not because she hadn't been ready to let go, but because there was one part of him that needed to stay close until she knew what to do with it. The tide was low, the waves slow and even. She wore the red scarf he once pulled from the bottom of a drawer, still carrying the scent of cedar and old days. The wind tugged at the corners of her coat, and for a moment, she closed her eyes and imagined his arm around her one last time. She stepped to the edge of the water, opened the urn, and let go. The ashes caught the breeze like silver dust, lifting toward the sunlit horizon. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just smiled, softly, like a woman who had learned that goodbyes aren't always endings. That night, back at the house, she picked up the recorder. She hadn't touched it since his last night. She pressed the worn record button. My name is Clara, she said quietly, and this is what love looked like when the cameras were off. She paused, then added, You weren't perfect, but you were mine. For the part that mattered most. She stopped the recording, labeled the file, Final Chapter, and let it be. Not the end of a story, just the beginning of its echo.